Thank you, Rabbi Kay. This is indeed not the way we anticipated launching our third year of the Israel Dialogues. It's a terribly sad and difficult time. I appreciate very much Rabbi Kay's remembering our colleague and friend Howard Edelman, who was so important to this program and so important to many of us in so many ways, who passed away this past summer. He will be missed, and it's obvious why we have convened, with the help of Holy Blossom, this special Israel Dialogues. And as Rabbi Kay mentioned, coincidentally and fortunately, we have with us our longtime friend and colleague, Professor Asher Susser from Tel Aviv University, professor of Middle East history, contemporary history, as well as the former director for a number of terms of the Dayan Center of Middle East and African Studies at Tel Aviv. Before calling on Asher, I'm going to turn to Mark Anshin, who is going to provide some introductory thoughts on the Jewish community in terms of the implications of the past week's events, its meaning, the meaning of these events to the diaspora, perhaps questions about the relationship now, again, between the diaspora and Israel. And following that, we're going to turn to Asher, who's going to provide us not just an update, but an analysis from someone who's not only lived much of Israel's contemporary history and participated in it as a scholar, advisor, and soldier, but who can give us some perspective and understanding from an expert on the contemporary Middle East and the Arab world, the Palestinians. So with that, let me first turn to Mark. And before Mark takes over, let me remind everyone that we strongly hope that you will have questions and comments. And if you could submit them, I think on, would it be the Q&A or on the Q&A? We'll try and respond to them in the time that we have. So, Mark, over to you.
Thank you, David. October 7th, 2023 is now emblazoned in our memory and will be another sad date on the Jewish calendar. It will be one of the tragedies of our people, on par with all the horrors we have faced as Jewish people, including the destruction of the Second Temple, the pogroms of Eastern Europe, Kishinev, Babi Yar, Kristallnacht, the Holocaust. What happened last Shabbat was a pogrom. Hamas terrorists' objective was to kill Jews and rid the area, Israel, of Jews. My friend Rabbi Ami Hirsch stated it clearly the other night in New York City. We saw in vivid reality what a pogrom looks like. Mass mayhem and murder. Make no mistake, Israeli civilians were massacred because they were Jews. Anti-Israel protesters make no attempt to hide. Gaz the Jews, they shrieked in front of the Sydney Opera House. And therefore, this is a crisis that concerns every one of us. It affects our children. It affects our future. It threatens every Jew worldwide and every decent person. So said Rabbi Hirsch. Hamas learned their history well. Their goals are no different than the Nazis in World War II. This was a true act of unbridled barbarism, evil, and inhumanity. President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, and our own Prime Minister have, together with other leaders in the free world, been clear about what this was and what it means for us as Jews, and for those who continue to care and fight for the human rights of all people. Let's be clear. This had nothing to do with the conflict between Israel and the Palestinian people. Conflict resolution between parties takes place when each recognizes the right of the other to exist. This is not the case with what happened. This is not the week, nor perhaps in the coming weeks, to try and relate this event, the pogrom on Jewish Israelis, to the roots of the conflict. To once again dive into a deep analysis of the complexities of the issues and the possible means for resolutions. We have done all that before, and there will be time to do it again soon. But at this moment, in these days, we mourn as Jews in the diaspora, and we mourn with our Israeli family. And we will continue to mourn far longer than the Shloshim. Asher will help us understand how Israel and our Israeli family are dealing with this horror, coping with this horror, and he will provide us hopefully with a clear perspective on what this will mean for Israel going forward. But for us in the diaspora, it is now important that we come together, as we have done, that we hold each other, pray together, and do all we can to provide material, financial, and emotional support for Israel. Many of us know firsthand of loved ones who were murdered and kidnapped. We have been in constant touch with our Israeli friends and family. We need to continue to do that. Each call, each connection brings some small degree of comfort to them. At this webinar, we will share our feelings and learn and discuss what this tragic event experienced by Israeli Jews means for their future, and, as important, what it means for us as Jews here in the diaspora. Asher, please.
Yeah, thank you. You know, looking at this from the press in Israel and the public opinion, the three big words that come to mind. The one is the enormous grief and the sense of humiliation and the fury in the Israeli public, looking at the horrendous losses that we have suffered on the last Shabbat. Calling this a pogrom is what it was in many respects, but this raises an enormous question about Israel. Israel was established to be a place where pogroms did not happen. And therefore, this is an event of historical, existential significance. And it is absolutely critical for Israel in carrying out the military campaign to reestablish Israeli deterrence, to guarantee Israel staying in power for the long term, and not only to influence the relationship between Israel and Hamas, but to influence the relationship between Israel and the regional equation. A regional equation in which Israel's power is not recognized and respected will be a regional equation in which Israel will find it difficult to function and to last. So the war against Hamas is not another round in the fight, but a military confrontation, perhaps one of the most important, if not the most important, that Israel has ever waged since the War of Independence in 1948. So in the meantime, it's an air war against Gaza and against the Hamas infrastructure and its personnel. The objective is to dismantle Hamas militarily, to dismantle it as a political ruling body in Gaza. This is a tall order. Those who speak of totally destroying Hamas may be setting a target which is not achievable. Hamas as an organization, as an ideology, will probably remain. But it is absolutely crucial that we dismantle its military capability and completely degrade it. Only at the end of that kind of operation will we be able to negotiate the release of all the Israeli hostages. And I mention the Israeli hostages because maybe the foreign hostages could be released earlier by some other different negotiating channel. But I don't think we will be able to get the Israeli hostages, civilians and soldiers alike, until this operation is over and there's some kind of deal about hostages and prisoners. The very long-term perspective for Gaza, I would say, hopefully from the Israeli point of view, and I say hopefully, it all depends on how the confrontation works itself out, is for the Palestinian Authority to eventually return to Gaza. And maybe with some kind of Egyptian assistance. And that would make a stabilizing political infrastructure in common with the strengthening of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, which could create opportunities for more political moves much later on. But that is far down the line. The big question that Israelis have to look at now, is this just between Israel and Hamas? Are others going to join in the battle? And the key question here, of course, is Hezbollah. Will they come in? Do they intend to come in? Very difficult question. I'm not sure that Hezbollah and the Iranians have made their minds up yet. In the meantime, Hezbollah is walking a very fine line, keeping Israel busy on the northern front, but not taking any action that would be an inclusion of them in the actual war. The decision is to be made in Tehran and not in Lebanon. And no final decision has already been made as far as we know, but that could change literally at any minute. Iran has concerns. Iran didn't build Hezbollah in order to waste it on the Palestinians. Iran built Hezbollah to protect Israel, to protect Iran from Israeli attack, and to use Hezbollah as a deterrence against Israel attacking Iran, not to waste it on Gaza. So I think there you see the hesitation, that had they intended to be in this from the start, they would have been. And the war has already gone on for a week and they're still out of it. So there is obviously some thinking there and some hesitation in Iran and in Beirut. Lebanon as a country is in deep trouble anyway without having to take on Israel. They are facing a political and economic disaster without any confrontation with Israel. And therefore, I would think that the Lebanese public have no appetite for Hezbollah dragging them into a war with Israel. Looking again at the broader picture, the Hamas attack was definitely an attack against Israel, an attack against Jews, and had all the intentions of weakening Israel and undermining its stamina and stability. But from the Iranian point of view, this is also an effort to shoot down the idea of an Israeli-Saudi normalization and to torpedo that whole American idea. What could affect their decision, the Iranian decision? The land operation in Gaza, if it takes place, when it takes place, may be seen by them as requiring a need for their intervention. That's a possibility. There is even a possibility of Israel preempting and attacking Hezbollah first. If Israel thinks that some kind of offensive is about to begin from their end. There could also be direct Iranian involvement by using this as an opportunity to attack Israel, maybe using their own militias that are in Syria and in Iraq. But that's a long shot. And the truth of it is that we don't really know. A few words about the US. Definitely the deployment of US naval assets in the Mediterranean is critically important to deter outside involvement, whether it is from Iran or Hezbollah. Morally and operationally very important for Israel. Important to replenish Israeli stores, the US role. And as Biden keeps on saying, having Israel's back. But we also have to remember that this US presence also raises questions about a principle that Israel has had and held since its foundation. Israel defends itself by itself. And I think Israel would be very encouraged to have the US presence deterring foreign intervention. And as the Americans say, having Israel's back. But I think in this case, as well, Israel would rather defend itself by itself. It's important for the long term as well. The US presence in the Mediterranean has an important regional impact beyond Israel. And this has to do with US foreign policy and not directly with Israel. This is a message to Iran. It's also a message to other US friends in the region. Saudi Arabia, Jordan, the Gulf states, Egypt would all like to see in a crisis like this a strong American stand. That is to reassure them that America also has their back vis-a-vis Iranian Shiite radical expansionism. And the last comment I would make is on the positive side, what one could call the Israeli spirit. The massive mobilization independently of Israel's civil society in providing whatever a rather dysfunctional Israeli government hasn't been successful in providing in the last few days. An absolute amazing self-mobilization of the entire society of Israel. And I would say here in parenthesis, even to a certain degree, including the Haredim, who are showing in certain parts of the Haredi community a sense of participation in the war effort, the likes of which we have never seen on their part. Hundreds and thousands of young Israelis touring the world are all flying back to Israel to join their units and go to the battlefield. This is Israel's major power. This is absolutely, I say unbelievable, but knowing my people, it is entirely believable. That is who we are. And that is who we really are. And I would say with a society like that, we cannot be beaten. Thank you.
Thank you, Asher, very, very much. I'm sure that's stimulated a lot of questions as Mark's comments. So let me turn to John and Dylan and invite them for some initial responses. Dylan?
Thanks, David, and thanks as always, Asher. Just as we look at, initials or Israel's initial response and the overarching goal of either trying to remove Hamas or to disable its ability to make threats like this ever again. I was listening to a podcast in the last couple of days, trying to think of who the person was that, or maybe it was actually an article in the New York Times that said, beware the experience of the United States and trying to go into urban warfare environments and change very complex status quos, and also beware, the United States' experience in Afghanistan, where after 20 years and billions of dollars and spent treasure and spent lives, the Taliban are indeed back in power. So what do you think about the, realism, the realistic possibilities of extracting Hamas and accomplishing those goals? And in this particular moment, obviously, the stomach is there for a very deep fight, but if it could take months or even stretch on longer than that, what does that mean for Israel? I guess that's more of a question than just thoughts, but one of the things that's burning on my mind.
Well, I could respond to that.
Please.
I think that is a really genuine major concern that we have in Israel too. And we're very well aware of the limitations, particularly fighting in a place like Gaza. We've done it before. But I think there's a very strong sense in Israel at the moment, and I think this will be a lasting sense, something the Americans could never have felt about Afghanistan or Iraq. We have no choice. And our long-term survivability depends on it. That was never true about the US in Afghanistan or in Iraq, nor in Vietnam. And I think you see the masses of Israelis trying to catch planes to fly home, the young boys to join their units. Like we haven't seen this since the Yom Kippur War in '73. And I think the scale of it now is even greater. Is this recognition that our lives depend on it. And therefore, I think there is a lot of determination in Israel to see this through, even if it is very difficult. But that will also mean that the way this war will be conducted will be in a way which will minimize Israeli casualties as much as quite possible, which also means that the manner in which the ground operation will be conducted, I'm sure it will be heavily supported by air and artillery cover in a way that may arouse international criticism. But I think this will be part of the manner in which the campaign is waged. And I think there's a lot of thinking, and I hope there is even more, about conducting this in a non-conventional way, in the sense that the planning is original, something that Hamas won't expect. Don't walk in exactly the way they expect you to walk in. Be very original, be very indirect about this, the indirect approach. The smart Israeli way of conducting war, as we have done in so many other instances. And I think a lot of that kind of imaginative thinking has to go into the way in which we do this. It's time for us to surprise them, not only for them to surprise us. And hopefully this is being worked into the calculation of the ground operation.
Dylan, do you have follow up on that?
I mean, I guess I would say, from my own thoughts in terms of the rules of the game have changed. We were talking just, before this call about Hamas realizing that the rules of the game have changed for Israel. I mean, one of the interesting and I think astute observations I've heard in the last few days is that in the last 10 or 15 years, Israel's moved from its traditional strategic posture around defense, which was, we need to fight the war over there. We need to fight the war outside because we can't afford to fight it on the home front. And that actually Iron Dome and the protections, around Gaza, the security barrier, et cetera, has actually made them, change to a mentality of fighting the war on their own soil. And that this may be an impetus to changing that calculation again and rethinking the way they've approached this for the last 15 or so years.
Yeah, just let me add one comment on that. Israel's military doctrine always was, the country is too small, too heavily populated to fight the war on our own turf. The war must always be carried over to the enemy's turf as soon as possible. But the Arabs have also learned a lesson. And they have forced Israel onto the back foot with rocketry in a way that never existed ever. Not in the War of Independence did we ever have the threat on the home front that we have now. And we could always fight our wars on their territory, on our terms, almost always, until the advent of rocketry. And this has changed the equation, not in our advantage. And we have to find ways and means of carrying the war to their territory and fighting it on their territory, but at the same time, exposing our home front as we see it daily today. We are hammering Gaza, but we are suffering on the home front as well. And if Hezbollah were to intervene, that would even be greater and would make things more complicated than they are.
John, let me turn to you.
Well, this is going to be an Ask Usher question, I think, panel. Usher, you mentioned the fact that current polls suggest that Bibi is now only possibly going to win 19 seats.
Likud, yeah, Likud.
In Likud only win 19 seats, which means that the coalition would not win, and that we would have eventually a new government. This is, of course, we're not going to see an election until after the war, perhaps not until after an inquiry, but I think most of us agree that Bibi's done, either because of the 39 weeks of protests or because of what has happened on the weekend. I just wanted to ask you, going forward, and I'm not talking about weeks, I'm not talking about months, I'm talking about maybe years going forward. Do you see the country, as a result of this, moving even farther to the right and more hardline on the question of peace with the Palestinians? Or do you see the possibility that if you can wipe out Hamas, there might be an effort to reach out to moderate Palestinians if they exist? I know it's eyeballing the future, but I'd be interested in your views.
Well, I think, first of all, there was this poll published in Maariv this morning. Maariv has a poll every Friday, so this is nothing unusual. But in the poll of Maariv, as I was told in a phone call with somebody at home, the Likud gets 19 and the coalition has 42. That's a long way away from the 64 they have at present. And Gantz is over 40. So it looks like a government in the future, if this means anything, would be a government that would be very different from the one that we have in power now. They're very unpopular. Ministers from the government who appear in public are accosted. Two of them who visited wounded people in hospital were thrown out of the hospital. By the public, that is, the people enraged seeing these ministers visiting the wounded, especially as it took them 3 or 4 days even to think of doing that. They were thrown out. So I think that Israel would be more right-wing, more radical. I don't think that's the direction that things will be going. I do hear people saying, as I said in my remarks, that there's a long-term possibility that if Hamas is weakened significantly, not destroyed, Hamas is also an ideology. The ideologies are not destroyed. And Hamas will be there and they will remain there. But if the PA, the Palestinian Authority, could be returned to Gaza, perhaps with the backing of the Egyptians, a fairly long time from now, and we carry out a policy whereby we are reinforcing the Palestinian Authority, both in the West Bank and in Gaza, that is a formula for re-establishing some kind of political negotiation. A long shot of where this present government was taking Israel. And I think that there is a good chance that that would happen. There's a good chance that that would have happened even without this war. I think the protest movement was eventually going to have to deal with the question of the continuation of the occupation. Sooner or later, they would have had to address the issue. And in the last few weeks, you spoke of 39 weeks. Well, in the last few of those 39, this is an issue that has been creeping into the debate. Okay, you guys talk about democracy in Israel, fine. Let's save Israel's democracy from those who are trying to undo it. But how do you do that without dealing with the occupation? You can't have a liberal Israeli democracy focusing alongside a 50-something year occupation. Something has to be done about that. So I think, you know, these are great moments, but this is all to become a reality, hopefully, but when the war is over. We're now fighting the war, and we have to win this war decisively. It has to be very clear to the entire Middle East that Israel won decisively and on its own. Israel fighting for Israel. That has to be very clear. And I think that is what is driving the Israeli military response in Gaza. That's why it looks the way it looks. And this is going to continue to look like this, even with the ground operation. And as I say, the motivation of the Israeli public on the one hand, and the fury of the Israeli public on the other, I think are going to give the military operation a great deal of overall consensual backing, and more so since the creation of the new cabinet, the new, let's say, war cabinet with Gantz and Eisenkot, these two former chiefs of staff, in there with Bibi. There are not too many people in Israel, I think, who have confidence in Netanyahu being even able to wage this himself. And Gantz and Eisenkot were very keen to join in the new government, if only to make sure that Bibi doesn't run this on his own, because nobody believes that he's really capable of doing a reasonable job. And that has given the public, I think, a much greater sense of self-assurance. It's very good for the military. The military has a very good working relationship with the Minister of Defense and with Gantz and with Eisenkot, who are their former colleagues. They're former senior officers. So there's a much better bond, I would say, between the chief of staff, the senior military, and now the cabinet making the decisions. When this is all over, we're obviously going to have to rethink the strategies that we have conducted over the last few years. Many people in Israel, and certainly myself, were not great fans of what was being done. The notion that we could make peace with the Emirates and then make some normalization with the Saudis while ignoring the Palestinian question, I think many didn't believe that that was a realistic option anyway. And I think it's even less realistic now, but that's all on the back burner and will remain there for a long time. We have to come out of this, and we have to come out of this very decisively, and then we'll think about the big questions that John has raised, which I agree are questions that we cannot avoid.
So I'll just ask one more question, a follow-up, David, if I may. You mentioned the Abraham Accords. People obviously have been speaking about the fact that one of Hamas's reasons for doing this was the interest of Hezbollah, and of course Iran in sidelining the Israel-US Arab deal, which they all would have perceived as a threat for different reasons, but obviously Hamas seeing it as accruing benefits to the PA and Iran, and Hezbollah simply feeling the threat. So do you agree with people that say that this is now off the table in the short to medium term? Yeah, I'll just leave it there.
I think it's off the table in the short and the immediate term. I don't think it's something that Israel can seriously discuss as long as the war is our top priority. But I don't think it's off the table forever. And I see the US presence in the Mediterranean as part of that equation. This is a message from the US to its friends. We have your backs too. And we have your backs vis-a-vis Iran. And this is very encouraging, actually, for the Saudi-Israeli agreement on normalization, which is all part of the Saudi attempt to obtain US guarantees for their defense. So I think that actually the position taken by the United States in this particular confrontation is also a direct message to the Saudis to hang in there, because we, the US, have your back too vis-a-vis Iran. And, you know, don't discount the United States. Don't count us out. Count us in the regional equation. And I think, therefore, the Saudi, Israel, US discussion is still very much there when this is all over. I think it's been delayed, but not cancelled. But that will also require an Israeli response to the US-Saudi idea on what it is that we are willing to do on the Palestinian question, which was in there even before this war began. And obviously Hamas has no intention whatsoever to advance anything that has to do with peacemaking with Israel. We're all fully aware of that. But this has now provided an opportunity maybe to weaken Hamas and to reinforce the PA, the Palestinian Authority, in a way that when all of this is over, we can reshuffle the cards of the Palestinian internal balance of power that will be conducive to progress on the peace process also at a much further down the road. But it would, I think, be wrong on our part to believe that because there is this horrific war and because Hamas have conducted this unbelievable atrocity, that the idea of ever making peace with the Palestinians should be written off. I don't think we can afford to do that. We as Israel have to find some kind of arrangement for the 7 million or so Palestinians with whom we live. And they are there, no matter what happens. It has, we can make peace with Saudi Arabia and Bahrain twice a day. 7 million Palestinians live next door. And with us in Israel too, as part of the 7 million.
Thank you.
Thank you. Once again, I encourage people to write in their questions to the Q&A. We have a couple that I'm going to turn to in a moment. I know Dylan has a question or a comment or an engagement, but before I turn to Dylan, let me just ask you, Asher, the issue of Hamas in the West Bank. I mean, we know there's Hamas has made significant gains recently in the West Bank. The PA seems to be increasingly fraught and weak. Fatah, we don't hear a great deal about, at least in the Western press, on what they're doing to countering Hamas. So again, this is crystal ball perhaps, but your expectations or thoughts about how the current Israel's efforts of addressing Hamas in Gaza is going to impact Hamas in the West Bank. Will Hamas simply re-energize themselves in the West Bank to try and assert themselves even more so, since they can claim military credibility? Or will this give opportunity to undermine them there as well?
Well, we can have a look and see what's happened over the last 24 hours in the West Bank. Hamas, with Gaza in the background, wanted to ignite the West Bank.
Yeah.
It didn't happen. There were some demonstrations in favor of Hamas in the West Bank. Particularly, there was a big one in Hebron. And the Palestinian Authority let it be. They didn't try and put this down or do anything about it, which is, I suppose, to be expected. And I think that Hamas will make important inroads in the West Bank against the Palestinian Authority, with Gaza in the background. Palestinians everywhere are going to identify with the Palestinians in Gaza as this war progresses. But there is also a certain measure of reservation amongst Palestinians in the West Bank and Palestinians in Israel about what Hamas did. They are not ISIS. And these Palestinians in the West Bank and in Israel don't believe in ISIS. And therefore, not everybody, many people are encouraged by what Hamas did, but there are also many who were discouraged by it and are afraid also of a possible extreme Israeli response, which could be very damaging to them. So there's a measure of caution there too. even if people are emotionally supportive of Hamas. Now, we also have to remember, when there were elections in 2006 in the West Bank, Hamas won them long before this happened. And Hamas, you see polls in the West Bank conducted before the war, but recently, Hamas could have won elections again in the West Bank. It was very, touch and go. They're popular, and the PA is not popular. And the PA has a built-in weakness. The PA is a product of Oslo. It makes sense and gives the PA legitimacy if Oslo is brought to fruition. But if Oslo is not brought to fruition, who needs the PA? If Oslo is not brought to fruition, and all the PA does is cooperate with Israel, then in the eyes of many Palestinians, they're collaborators. The PA's effectiveness is a function of Oslo and a function of the continuation of the Oslo process. That's why the PA was established, in order to fulfill the process, to bring it to its conclusion. And if it doesn't, and it's just left there as a police force in order to help Israeli security, then there are too many people amongst the Palestinians who are going to say that the PA is not doing what it's supposed to be doing, the Palestinian Authority. And this is where Israel and the way in which Israel conducts its business has a contribution to make to this internal balance. But again, I say, all of this is for much later. This is all for, it's a luxury to talk about this now. We first have to win the battle, and decisively so. And then we can talk about all the other things. It's, I say it's a luxury to talk about it now.
So a more immediate question is from Anne Dublin, who asks whether you could confirm the rumor that Egypt warned Bibi about the Hamas attack 3 days in advance. And if it's true, what are the implications?
Well, there have been a number of reports and of this, also confirmed yesterday or the day before by US sources in Congress, that the US had intelligence about this also. That is, that the US didn't know about the attack, but they did know about some kind of information passed on by the Egyptians. We don't know the truth of this entirely. I think there definitely was something there. There has also been a report in the Israeli press in the last 24 hours that the IDF had its own information. And that was even discussed a few hours before the Hamas attack began. That something was happening in Gaza, something was moving, but it wasn't fully understood, and basically it was discounted. It's like Yom Kippur all over again. That is, it's not a lack of intelligence, but interpreting what it is that you see incorrectly. And that is what happened again. And when the chief of staff in his speech said that, we, the IDF, failed and we bear responsibility, I'm sure that when this is all over, quite a few senior officers in the IDF are going to resign, even before a commission of inquiry is established. But none of that is going to happen now, of course.
Dylan, you've been waiting patiently, and then I'll turn to another question on the list.
Well, I can see one of the questions is about Trump, David, and what that would mean. And so maybe I'll kind of ask my piece, and then you can put that question into for Asher to answer. But I wonder a bit about the, reaction in Israel, if there was much of any. I mean, I certainly saw it reported in the English language Israeli press on the tweets by Donald Trump that you know, seemed a little bit unhinged. I mean, going after Netanyahu personally, you know, very, very petty, and how that was received in Israel. And I think jumping off or onto the question that's in the Q&A, what a Trump 2.0 presidency would potentially mean for Israel. And I'll tell you, I mean, in my own analysis from the first one, I feel like the government in Israel sort of figured, well, we better take what we can get out of Trump, but at the same time, you know, had some caution about how trustworthy he might be, or how steadfast or stable a partner he might be. And there were rumors, you know, during the first Trump presidency about wariness of sharing intelligence, you know, where that intelligence might wind up if it were in the hands of Donald Trump. So I guess, you know, broadly speaking, from the question, the Q&A, and also the recent comments, what Israel might think about that in light of the current circumstances.
Well, you have to see this in the broader context of the US and Israel. Trump is in complete contradistinction to Biden. The Israelis were amazed by Biden's speech. Israelis of all shapes and sizes, left, right, people on the right are even saying that they should apologize to the way they treated Biden before. There is a huge amount of criticism of the Israeli government in the way it had conducted itself vis-a-vis the Biden administration. Considering how Biden has come out in a Zionist speech. I mean, what more could Israelis ask? And what Israelis said when they heard the Biden speech is, why don't we have a leader like that who can speak to us? They compared Biden favorably to Netanyahu. There's no speech like that from Netanyahu. You won't find one. And then against that background, Trump comes out with this outrageous stuff. And I think that Israelis of the right, Israelis of the left don't need to be convinced about this, but I think Israelis of the right will be far less enamored by a Trump administration looking ahead than they might have been had these incidents not happened. And had Biden not come out in such a phenomenal way in Israel's favor, and I think many Israelis recognize that and feel a sense of guilt of not having related to Biden better than they had over the last 10 months or so. So I think, you know, but it all depends on how we come out of this. You know, the elections in the US are a long way away, and a lot is going to happen in the Middle East until that occurs. But I think Israelis will be far less enthusiastic about a Trump administration than they might have been if these circumstances had not occurred.
John.
Thanks. Just looking at sort of at the bigger picture, now that you've raised the question of the U.S. and its policy in the Middle East, let's go even beyond. The U.S. has faced incredible opposition in the global South to its efforts to unite the world against Russia on the Ukraine issue. I think much to many of our surprise, in Latin America, the integrity of one's territory and borders was supposed to be the principle in the face of previous Spanish and U.S. invasions, and yet Russia invades Ukraine and they don't join in. And the argument, of course, was we don't join in because we don't want to be seen to supporting the imperialist U.S. who invaded Vietnam and Iraq, et cetera, et cetera. So now you've got a situation where, depending what happens in the war, and inevitably the support for Israel, which is crucial and which is much deserved and necessary for the action, inevitably that is going to turn, because there will be death and destruction, as we know, and the supporters of Palestinians in the world, et cetera, will turn, and the coverage will turn, and Israel will be inevitably forced into the same criticism that happens every time. But I wonder about the impact on U.S. policy. I mean, isn't this absolute and complete support for Israel, which is seen in many parts of the global south, not as the David, but as the Goliath, isn't that going to impact their policies and their stature and the rest of the world? I know Israel doesn't care about it, shouldn't care about it, but you would think that the US might be a little concerned going forward.
I don't feel competent to comment on the US, quite honestly.
Okay, then not to worry. We'll just leave it out there as a comment as opposed to a question. I see there's two more hands up there.
Yes. So let me ask, invite Mark and then Dylan, and then we'll go back to the list.
So I think this is all very interesting and an important discussion, but I'd like to bring us back to the impact on Israel and the Israeli people. And Asher, as an Israeli and somebody who is very involved and connected to what's going on within the Israeli community, can you give us some deeper thoughts about the impact on you personally and on your friends, your relatives, and the general Israeli side, what this event will have going forward in terms of the emotional, the psychological paradigm for Israelis?
Well, I think something very basic has been seriously damaged. And that is the overall confidence of the Israeli people as a collective in their personal individual security. That we have never had an attack on Israeli civilians of this nature. Never. In the Yom Kippur War, the war was fought by the army, far away from the civilian population. All our prisoners were soldiers. In this particular case, I think most of the hostages are civilians. The death of civilians is far greater than we've ever had in any day of warfare in all of Israel's history. There is a certain sense of basic insecurity. The wildest of messages on the social media of some Arab somewhere threatening the Israeli people gets the whole population in a frenzy. Everyone wants to have their town or village with a security detail, armed security detail there permanently, like the ones on the kibbutzim that did manage to fight it with the Hamas attack initially and stave off the initial attack until the army arrived. The chief of staff said this, I think, in the most cogent fashion, that the contract between the IDF and the people has been broken. This has to be reestablished. This has to be reestablished in a very convincing way. First of all, vis-a-vis the Israeli people themselves. I mean, take the members of the kibbutzim that were slaughtered and the kibbutzim that were destroyed over the weekend. Are the survivors going to go back to the kibbutz? They won't go back unless they're absolutely convinced that this is not going to happen again. Now, who is going to reassure them this is not going to happen again? Now, let's say these kibbutzim are not reestablished and they don't go back to where they were before. What does this say about Israel's long-term survivability? Therefore, this military campaign, and again I say, against the background of the international criticism that may increase, what is at stake for us is so directly personal that the Israeli people will be so determined to see this through, even if our casualties are high, because of what it means for the long-term survivability of the Israeli state and the individual Israeli person? These are the kinds of questions. That's why when people say pogrom, this is to the Israeli psyche, to the whole Zionist enterprise, is stunning. We are supposed to be the solution to pogroms. We are supposed to be the prevention of pogroms forever. We are the safe haven of the Jewish people. The pogrom that took place in Israel on Shabbat is far worse than any pogrom I know, other than the Holocaust itself. Worse than Kishinev, worse than Babi Yar. This contract between the defense establishment, the government, the state, and the people has to be restored. And the decision to take the fight to Hamas and to win it very decisively is an essential precondition for the restoration of this contract with the IDF and the government. So it's a much bigger issue than what happened on Shabbat. What happened on Shabbat is absolutely disastrous. The hostage situation is unbearable. But the questions that Israel has to answer to as a state, as a society, are much greater than both of these questions. They are existential. They are about the long-term survivability of our historical project. That sounds maybe a little bombastic, but that's what it's really about. And I think the Israeli people, whether they express this openly or not, is what is going through people's minds and what it is that they think about. And that is also an explanation for the exposure and the revelation of this phenomenal Israeli spirit. It is also the mobilization of the Israeli spirit against the background of the threat that the people are responding in an unbelievable way because they can sense what the long-term challenge is. And this is where I think many people feel that Netanyahu and company are detached from reality. They don't get it. They are not fully tuned in to the reality.
Asher, you've
Thank you.
comments that you've answered the question that Carol Payne wrote in about us winning the war and the decimation and the slaughter of Gazan civilian population that may occur. You put it in that context. And I've been reading in many of the commentaries and the analysis, there continues to be putting questions in the context of international law. And of course, international humanitarian law comes right up against what Israeli forces will have to deal with in Gaza. And this is one of those conundrums, dilemmas, which seems to be no easy answer, in the sense that someone who is going to take a strict international humanitarian law position will not be comforted by what you say as the rationale and the need. And that's one of those paradoxes that I think we're all going to have to live with as this thing unfolds.
I think just to add one sentence after what your remark, first of all, I'm sure 100% that you're right. We will have to face that dilemma. But what I think that really people in the outside world the journalistic world and the political world and the academic world, they don't fully appreciate what the ultimate challenge is to us. We are not Goliath. If we were, it wouldn't be a problem. We are not the neighborhood bully. We are under threat. And as far as I know, the whole question of proportionality in the international legal discussion is not about one death for one death. Proportionality is about removing the threat, the force required to remove the threat, and not exercising far too much force in order to remove what the threat is. But what the threat is to us ultimately is existential. People stand with banners in the demonstrations against Israel in New York, or maybe even here too, with the Hamas slogan, "From the river to the sea." Well, excuse me, but what does that mean? That from the river to the sea, we have to see what we saw on Shabbat? That's what you call genocide. So let's get real here with what it is that we're dealing. Now, that doesn't mean that Israel can do whatever it likes and that we have a free hand to do whatever we please. We don't, and we're, I think, as aware of that as anybody around. But what is at stake here is not understood. I think John said that in the developing world, Israel is the giant. They're wrong. In some ways we are, and in other ways we are not, very much not. You don't do to giants what they did to us on Shabbat. And those who think we are giants and talk about from the river to the sea, what do you think Hamas has in mind for the Jews who live between the river and the sea? What you saw on Shabbat. So what are we supposed to do about that? Call the Red Cross? Speak to the UN? That is why our guiding principle has always been, we must be able to defend ourselves, because somebody else may not do it or may come late. And this is when you look at the Israeli people and you see all these young kids flying back from Thailand and from Australia and from all these wonderful holidaying places, South America, all flying back to Israel to join their units. I don't think all of them could give you a lecture on the subject, but instinctively they know what they're doing. And they know why they're doing it. And this, Golda is, I think Biden said that, Golda said to her that, Mr. President, we have a secret weapon. And the secret weapon is that we have nowhere else to go. Well, I wouldn't put it exactly in those words. But I would say that what is at stake for us is our very existence collectively and individually. And nothing more than what happened on Shabbat can indicate that to anyone who can see.
Well, before turning to Dylan, I would respond by saying I would hope that Israeli embassies and the Israeli government would finally get its PR section in order and be able to deliver the message that you just have. Because one of the things many of us have commented on is that over the years, Israel has done a very bad job in explaining itself, especially in these kinds of very difficult situations. The messaging has not been clear. It's not been forceful. And it's not been as articulate as you've just made it. Dylan?
Thanks, David. That's a hard string of statements to even follow up. But pulling on sort of the same vein, and Asher's comments about people in New York or in Ottawa or in Toronto holding a Hamas placard. I think for the diaspora community here in the United States and overseas, watching these revelatory celebrations of that attack in our streets made people both feel revulsion, but also to fear for their safety. And on the side of Israel, it's been remarkable, the Arab Street factor in all of this over the long term, and that each of these things makes it more and more complex to conduct diplomacy within the Arab Street, and I think also within Arab diaspora communities in places like the United States and Canada. And so I wonder, I know your expertise on the Arab world, maybe for some commentary on the Arab world, but I also just want to note, and you may have commentary on it also, the power of expressing concern for the civilians on the other side. And I think Israeli officials do it far too infrequently in their public commentary. And when they do it, it often doesn't sound genuine. And I think we should care about those people. And I think that it's also important in terms of the long-term coexistence for Israel in the Middle East, that it learns to do it better.
Well, and I would just add that it's in Israel's interests. It's in Israel's strong interest to say it, whether they believe it or not, because, and many do, but to say it, because then they take some of the burden off. We are protecting ourselves. It is our existence. But at the same time, our intention is not to wipe out another people. It's to wipe out a military threat. But of course, in another government, we may get a better diplomatic advocacy, and I hope we will.
I think on this issue, like on so many other issues in Israel at the moment, civil society has filled in the gap of Israeli hasbara. There's a lot of stuff on the social media which is being produced by Israelis privately. Nothing, no contribution from the government, which has been apparently very effective. One of the things was the creation of this imagery of ISIS is Hamas. This was very much the work of private bloggers, Israeli citizens doing. The government has been very ineffective on this, as it has been on so many other things. But I think it is absolutely correct that we must show true and real empathy for the suffering of the others. For the Palestinians too. Obviously, we must. Genuinely. And I think we really do feel it. But it's a tough game to play when Yahya Sinwar and company do what they're doing right now in Gaza. We ask the people to move and they don't move because Hamas tells them otherwise, because they want the body count. And we, if it is the fight that I say it is, we cannot not carry it out, even if they do leave the civilians there. We have no choice.
And when they take like Vivian Silver, who's been fighting for peace her entire life.
Yeah. She's a hostage.
She's the Canadian hostage who has spent her whole life working with Bedouin, with Palestinians in Gaza.
We've been working with the Canadian government to try to work with her. That matter is on Minister Jolie's desk right now, and she's been working diligently on it. David, will you look at the chat, please? David. Thank you.
Yes. Sorry, Mark, was there something in particular?
Yeah, I sent you a chat message.
Oh, that message. While I look at that, let me just say that there's question of a different kind that I'd like to just read out, that perhaps Dylan or Mark or John, not either Usher or me, would be able to address, because it's local, it's in local politics. Freedom Moskowitz, how do we deal with the days of rage? Our own New Democratic Party in Canada and the union president of CUPE supports Hamas resistance fighters. So it's about the internal issues in Canada. Would anyone of you like to take a shot at this? Yeah, a shot at this? Dylan, please.
I'm happy to, and as you know, I spend a lot of my spare time involved in some of the, I don't know what you'd call it, establishment Jewish community organizations, and I think there's a great deal of fear in the community. I think lots of you got the alert from the Federation in Toronto yesterday of a reported stabbing outside of Chat, the Jewish school in North Toronto, for those who aren't from Toronto, which later turned out to be false, but still in opaque terms, alluded to some kind of altercation that may or may not have been related to this. I know communities are on edge. I've heard from others fighting and pushing, with their own Jewish schools in different cities. They need police officers out front. I know, one of our colleagues on this panel was talking about worry in coming to synagogue for his family members this weekend. My kids go to school regularly just by happenstance, wearing a t-shirt with Hebrew writing or something that alludes to Israel. And I told my wife, look, you need to go through their clothes and put them up in the cupboard, because God forbid they go out with something like this on. I will say, I would push back against the idea that the New Democratic Party sides with Hamas resistance fighters. Jagmeet Singh came out with a clear statement condemning the attacks when they happened, and has still, I wouldn't say I agree wholeheartedly with all of their positions, but has certainly not come out in favor of this. There was a case of a provincial member of provincial parliament in Ontario marching in support of at one of these jubilation rallies, supporting the attacks. And that was reprehensible, and I think she should resign or be pushed out of that caucus. But those examples are few and far between. I can tell you, I fielded calls from cabinet ministers across our federal government all week asking who can they call to send condolences. And I think that parties across the spectrum stand on the side of safety and security for the Jewish communities here. And I think you've seen the same thing in European capitals in a way that we've never seen in any of the previous waves of violence. I don't think that makes it easier. And I think that statements from some of the national Muslim organizations across the country have been very challenging, I think, for members of the Jewish community to process and accept. And I think that, I spend lots of time with a good friend of mine, Mohammed Hashim, who's the head of the National Center for Race Relations. John knows him well as well. And just talking about how do you put the genie back in the bottle on that kind of division. And, when you see that I think in the eyes of the Jewish community, that kind of a cold shoulder to the suffering that was going on this side. I think that, on our part, it's incumbent on us not to turn a similarly cold shoulder to the suffering on the other side as this operation continues, and to realize that lots of those people have family that are suffering or in danger also, and real reason to worry.
Thank you. I think we're getting close to our time. I will say, as we're about to depart, I'm first going to invite Mark Anshin, and then when we're done, perhaps to turn it back to Rabbi Sam Kay. We will hopefully be having another Israel dialogue sometime over the next few weeks. We're uncertain on that, but stay tuned. Once we get things clear in terms of the program, the agenda, information will be distributed. If anyone who's listening has suggestions of the things you would like us to have as a topic, please let us know. So, Asher, a particular thanks to you. I know it just is coincidence that you happen to be in Toronto and that you and I had dinner the other night, and I asked you to do this with us. And as always, we're very, very grateful. You've made an enormous difference to our understanding and appreciation in a way that we wouldn't have been able to achieve. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Mark, over to you, please. No, you're on mute, Mark.
Good.
Thank you. I think it's appropriate for us to end this with a prayer for Israel and a moment of silent prayer. So allow me, please. Avinu Shema Shemayim, Sur Yisrael V'Goali. God in heaven, rock and the redeemer of Israel. Bless the state of Israel, the first flowering of our redemption. Shield it with your love. Spread over it your canopy of peace. Enlighten its leaders with faith. And direct them with your good counsel. Our God, strengthen the hands of the defenders of our sacred land. Grant them salvation and crown them with victory. Establish peace in the land, everlasting joy for all its inhabitants. Let us say together, Amen.
Amen.
Moment of silent prayer. And then Rabbi Kim.
Rabbi Kay had to leave for another meeting, so I just want to express our appreciation on behalf of Holy Blossom. My camera is not coming on. Just want to I'll just speak. I just want to on behalf of Holy Blossom, I want to thank you, all of you. This was on short notice. Is obviously very important to us and to the people who are online. You will not be surprised to know that this has been the most viewed Israel Dialogues live session, and I'm sure there'll be lots more on video as well. But thank you all very much for giving us some very interesting insights and some very emotional thoughts as we go through and go into Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat shalom.